Again, it's been revealed British pilots have been carrying out airstrikes against Islamic State militants in Syria without Parliament's authorisation. The revelation came as a result of a Freedom of Information request by human rights group Reprieve. RT's Anna-Cecilia Churkin is picking up the story today.
After a Freedom of Information request by this human rights group Reprieve, it did come into the light that British Royal Air Force pilots have been involved in anti-ISIS airstrikes in Syria, much to the surprise of the British public and, of course, the British Parliament. Well, why? Because back in 2013, the House of Commons voted against any British military airstrikes and intervention in Syria. And at the time, the British Prime Minister seemed to have received the message.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
Well, something that was clear back then does not appear to be so clear anymore, because we do know that David Cameron and the Ministry of Defence here have been considering extending involvement in Syria, especially following the Tunisia attack that killed 30 British citizens. But certainly any such decision would have to come with a parliamentary vote, and that has not been the case. So this information now coming into the light is certainly sending MPs raging here in London. We also heard from the Ministry of Defence giving some sort of explanation, saying that British personnel are currently not conducting airstrikes in Syria and that any embed program is a long-standing one. So the excuse here is that British personnel and pilots in this case were involved in a wider program that lasted much longer, and the Ministry of Defence has been saying that when they are embedded in such a program, it's under the command of host nations of the coalition. Of course, aka this means the United States. And critics here have already been saying that this is sort of a wholesale of British pilots to sort of American operations. So certainly this is going to spark and continue to spark major debate, and more explanations will have to be announced, because critics are saying that this kind of revelation is just basically making any voting obsolete, because then the government goes ahead and does what it deems necessary.
Yeah, let's bring in Chris Bambury now, political analyst, get his thoughts on this. Hi there, Chris. Bearing in mind everything that Nastya has said there, without going over it all again, there was a clear message from UK Parliament that this shouldn't happen, and yet the Ministry of Defence says, well, it does happen when our forces, albeit a limited number, are operating under another command. So what's the point of voting then in the first place, if that's the case?
Well, it's a question which a number of MPs, including Conservative backbenchers, are asking. Well, there was a very clear vote 2 years ago against any involvement in military operations in Syria, and yet we discover in the same week that the United Kingdom's Defence Minister has said that he believes the RAF should carry out airstrikes in Syria as well as Iraq. So in the same week, we discover that 20 pilots embedded with the US Air Force have been involved in these operations in Syria. And the excuse, which as was mentioned, is that when they're in this embedded program, they're under American command. But this is embarrassing, I think, for the Cameron government. It was squeezed out of them by the Reprieve, this human rights group under Freedom of Information Act. They didn't want it revealed, just at the time when they're trying to raise once again the possibility of intervention in Syria on the back of the tragedy in Tunisia. So I think it's unfortunate they're trying to milk an opportunity there in terms of the innocent lives that were lost. But I don't think there is any taste. Sorry.
Well, what reaction so far then about this from the UK Parliament?
There has been a number of backbenchers, I say, including Conservative backbenchers, who are saying, why has this been allowed to happen when there was such a clear vote which involved the opposition Labour Party, but also a large number of Conservative MPs who rejected Cameron's suggestion of carrying out airstrikes in Syria. Very clear decision, and yet we discover RAF pilots have been bombing in Syria. As I say, in the same week that the Minister of Defence is suggesting that they should actually be carrying out, Britain should be involved in airstrikes in Syria as well as Iraq. So there is a suspicion here, and I think there is still no taste among the British public for intervention in Syria. Of course, people want to see something done about the rise of ISIS. But I think as well there is a growing debate that, firstly, airstrikes have been ineffective in themselves, and secondly, Western intervention plays into the hands of ISIS, allowing them to pose themselves as the defenders of the Muslim world against the Crusaders, against the Western powers. And the question has to be, of course, is once you have British personnel involved in airstrikes in Syria, as in Iraq, the question of escalation comes up. What happens if a British pilot is shot down? What is the response going to be of the British government? They're not just going to stand back and allow that pilot to be executed by ISIS. So the possibility of escalation creeps in as soon as there is any involvement.
Especially now, of course, with what's been happening in Tunisia. David Cameron's now seeking, isn't he, MP's approval to extend the fight against Islamic State. Are we going to see boots on the ground, more boots on the ground in Tunisia now?
What he is saying, he's prepared to use the SAS against Islamic State, which does mean special forces. They're not going to stop ISIS, I have to say. I mean, you know, ISIS is, unfortunately, has got control of a tranche of territory. It's got heavy weapons. You know, limited numbers of special forces aren't going to shift this. He's also saying they're going to carry out drone attacks, which, of course, means civilian casualties, as we know, which again plays into the hands of ISIS. The truth is, the West, you know, Britain, America, all the rest of them, have no coherent answer to this, because in the end there has to be troops on the ground to defeat ISIS, but they can't be British, French, American troops, because, as I say, that plays into the hands of ISIS. It's got to be the various forces in Syria and Iraq, and we know they won't rely on the forces fighting ISIS in Syria, and we know they're suspicious of the forces doing the actual fighting in Iraq because they see them as Iranian proxies.